Okay, I'm going to give a short introduction to Bill, who probably doesn't need much introduction. I've known Bill for, I think, about 25 years, although maybe the first 5 we actually had not met physically. It was all virtual. In the beginning, maybe some of it was a bit rough. Those who know Bill and me know that I'm much more sympathetic to Keynes than Bill is. And I think one of our first arguments was over Keynes's views on econometrics and his discussion or argument, whatever, with Tim Burton. But anyway, later we did meet, and I think it was at an ASSA meeting, and shortly after that we founded sister centers. Ours was CFEPS here at UMKC, Center for Full Employment Price Stability, and Bill founded Coffee. Ours eventually became much more of just a support for our graduate students, but Bill's became a major research institution. Over the years, he's gotten many large grants, and he supports a fairly large research staff. And that continues to today. How many years has Coffee been in existence? I can't remember. Since 1998. Okay. And he also created one of the first important blogs. It actually was the first blog I'd ever heard of. I had never heard of a blog before he started his Billy blog, which has been very important in spreading the word about modern money theory. He's a frequent commentator in the mainstream Australian media. His own work, I think, began in econometrics and labor economics, but he branched out into regional economics, spatial economics, and of course, modern money theory. He's also a rock star, and I don't mean that in the sense of sometimes economists are described as rock stars. He is a rock star, a musician, and I think in the 70s he was a member of a fairly popular Australian band, and they were rediscovered maybe a decade ago. And he now performs, I think, almost weekly in several different bands. He also was a track star in Australia.
It's embarrassing.
Oh, that's all right. And now still races bicycles. He's involved in urban farming at his house, and now in setting up a local energy co-op. So we've been working closely together for almost 2 decades, and about a decade ago we began our biggest project, which turned out to be much bigger than we ever expected. I think we thought we would be done in about 6 months, and here it is 10 years later. And finally, it looks like we see the end of the tunnel, a macroeconomics book, which from the very beginning started off as being what we were calling at that time a government-centered macroeconomics textbook, one that doesn't introduce the government in chapter 7. The government will be introduced in the very beginning of the story. And that should be out hopefully in 2017. So as you can see, Bill is going to be talking about what is new in modern monetary theory.
This is the reason I was wearing a tie. Okay, this is in the December 1935 preface. I just thought it was a nice little introduction. He was referring, of course, to his somewhat breach with classical theory. And as another introductory idea, I've done a lot of study in the last several years in social psychology. And because I've been trying to work out, in the wake of the global financial crisis, how the hell haven't we had a major breach in macroeconomics of a similar type that we had in the mid-70s, given the poverty of the mainstream approach which was exposed by the global financial crisis. And so that led me into trying to understand that from social psychology. And a really interesting example of this groupthink phenomenon, which is the way groups become patterned in their behaviour and insular and in denial and mob rule and all the rest of it, which is incredibly descriptive of the economics profession, is this character Joseph Altman, who was a US biologist. And he was the first person to really talk about neurogenesis, which is the way, he was the first person to really articulate the idea that humans, adults, this is getting feedback, that adults can regenerate their
pull it up so that we can hear you
Okay.
better and it doesn't rub against your jacket.
It was a rock star.
Don't sing, play instrument, don't sing. Hate microphones. And neurogenesis is this idea that adults can rebuild their brain cells. And that was extremely challenging for the perceived wisdom of the day. And of course it was because the area of research was very small, there was sort of like a mafia operating, and the dominant researcher at the time was really challenged by this idea, and Altman was basically vilified. And his research was suppressed by the group dynamics that was operating in this area of human biology. And it wasn't only in 1999 this woman, Elizabeth Gould, so-called rediscovered the idea. And of course now it's the dominant paradigm in that area. And this example is one of many to describe the way in which new ideas that challenge the mainstream are suppressed. And I just want to talk a bit about that today. And this leads to a sort of stylised development path in the way ideas enter and exit. And it's similar to what you learn in philosophy of science about the way paradigm conflict occurs and the way degenerative paradigms hang on, in Lakatosh's terminology, to even though they're bereft of all explanatory power, they still can maintain dominance for a period of time through the groupthink processes. And so the patterns are that initially when a new idea comes along, it's totally disregarded and ignored. It's not a threat, it's just disregarded. And we started working on our project in the early 90s, and had basically been ignored for maybe 20 years. Totally ignored. The second stage is when hostility starts to become visible, but there's no real engagement. And an example of this, I was on a panel in about 2003 or 4, something like that. And I was a keynote speaker, and then the discussant got up, and without engaging at all with what I said, I've only got a short statement to make. We've been visited by a man from Mars today. Everyone laughed their heads off. He proceeded to sit down, and that was the engagement. None. But that was the hostility vilification stage, the put-down stage, the humiliation stage. And then the third stage is that the ideas start to get some currency through whatever means, and then there's a threat perceived, and then engagement starts, which reinforces that hostility, but it's an engaged hostility. And that's where criticism becomes much more targeted. Some of the manifestations of that criticism is, oh, we knew all this all along. There's nothing new about this. We knew it all along. And at some point, and certainly in our research program, it becomes a self-evident truth. That we knew it all along becomes an acceptance of the idea. And that's when the paradigm shift occurs. So I want to talk about that sort of process and our experience and what it is that we are doing as part of this process. So imagine we're at a post-Keynesian conference just like this one, back in the 90s, beginning of our project. And I'm having this conversation with a post-Keynesian economist. There's probably several embedded in there, but they're all leading lights in the discipline. And they're very non-mainstream in their own self-representation. And, you know, some of the things I hear during the conversation are, oh, well, you know, interest rates are, and don't take me on historical accuracy there because I can't really remember all that word, but, oh, interest rates are very low at the moment. Government should be borrowing heaps and building public infrastructure and advancing employment. And so I say, yeah, why does the interest rate regime matter? They then say, oh, aren't those neo-classical economists stupid? They haven't understood that crowding out can't occur because we've got access to global markets now and there's endogenous money, so banks can create money, there's no finite savings. Yeah. And then I might have said, oh, but don't you understand the way in which fiscal deficits work through the banking system? And they sort of blank. And fiscal deficits incurred in the downturn are great because they help offset non-government non-spending. But they should be balanced in the upturn. They should be offsetting the upturn. Government should be saving in the upturn. They use terms like saving in the upturn. And I say, yeah, but isn't savings what households do when they're not consuming? And these things will become meaningful soon. And then they say, oh, aren't those neoclassical economists stupid? Public borrowing isn't a problem as long as R is less than G. In other words, public debt ratio is stable. I say, what does it matter what the public debt ratio is? They think I'm mad. And then they say, well, haven't you read James O'Connor? We get on to talking about fiscal choices of government. And they say, haven't you read James O'Connor? He knew 20 years ago, remember in 1990, James O'Connor writing in the early 70s, is that there's a fiscal crisis of the state now. We're being limited in our progressive program because our tax bases are shrinking and we can't do what we want to do because of this fiscal crisis of the state. And they say, and the state's being compromised. And I say, what by? Globalisation, they say. How does that compromise the state? Oh, if the state doesn't do what the big fund managers want, there'll be a currency crisis because of capital flight. And I say, well, how can capital really fly? And then another conversation is, well, we've got this inflation problem emerging and we need to batten down the supply side. How do you do that? Oh, we'll have an incomes policy. That's inflation control. We can have progressive stimulus as long as we batten it down with an incomes policy. And another statement might be, well, God, Bill, you're advocating large public sector job creation. How are we going to afford that? And then, unfortunately, and let's say we're a bit later because we're 2003, something around it, conference, and Robert Lucas Jr. has just given his presidential address to the association. And I had the unfortunate experience of encountering a new Keynesian, who I avoid like a plague typically. And the new Keynesian says, well, look, everything of interest is explained in our three-equation model built on micro-optimising principles. An IS curve, a Phillips curve, and an interest rate rule. And I say, yeah, but there's no financial sector, there's no banks. And then I'm told, I'm given a quick lecture on efficiency market theory. And then I'm told, well, markets are efficient. And I say, yeah, but there's no unemployment in your model even. Because the Phillips curve specifications typically are in output terms, not unemployment. And then I'm told, oh yeah, but the business cycle's dead. And then I'm given a discussion about the great moderation, that it's all solved. And, you know, the big macroeconomic questions of the day are solved. The only thing government should now be concerned about is deregulation. So both of those conversations, in my view, reflect the orthodoxy both in the post-Keynesian area and in the new Keynesian, the mainstream. And I don't believe they're straw persons. So let's motivate that. Sometime later, the GFC occurs. And my understanding of the GFC is that it demonstrated the complete poverty of the mainstream approach. In my view, the mainstream approach has no further credibility. It never had it anyway, but it should be openly obvious it has no credibility. And all these ad hoc changes to their new Keynesian macro models to fit the financial sector back in. The thing about new Keynesian models is that they're derived in such a way to be mathematically tractable and to be based upon their optimising principles. But of course then they can't explain any real world data. So then they chuck a few ad hoc assumptions in which to fit the data, which immediately violate their claim to be built on micro-optimising principles. It's just bereft of any credibility. And their ad hoc additions of the financial sector are just more of that same. But also relevant to this audience is that I think the GFC also exposed major deficiencies in the way post-Keynesians view macro. That's the other point. It's not just an attack on the mainstream. And one of the really significant parts of and I'm talking here about the small group of people that started off this, and I'm talking about Warren, Mosler, Randy Ray, Pavlina, I'll get confused with the surname, but we know who Pavlina is here, Stephanie Bell, Carlton, and myself. The small group, Scott came along soon after. One of the things that really we talked about a lot at that time, and we're talking, by the time that group was around, it was the mid-90s, a bit later maybe, I think the first meeting was 96, I can't quite remember, is that the developments in the financial sector as a result of deregulation was likely to lead to a major crisis. That really motivated us thinking about that. Long before we're talking a decade at least before the crisis. And then we set about building more and more of the approach. And in recent years, that approach is increasingly entering the popular discourse. There's no doubt about that. In part because of new technologies. And I remember we were having a meeting, I think there was Randy, Warren and myself, if I'm correct. And I announced really excited, I said, I'm going to start a blog. And Randy just looked at me as if I was mad. What the hell? And I think that, the blog now the social media has allowed us to reach a very wide audience not just of our peers in academic life, but in activists. And it's really spread and become quite, he's got his hand up. And many people, I think, are now seeing that the core ideas that we've been developing are actually a way in which to fill the void that they feel is left there by the bereftness of both the existing approaches, which are mainstream neo-Keynesian, new Keynesian and post-Keynesian, the extant post-Keynesian literature. But the increasing popularity has also brought all the criticism. We're now getting openly targeted, whereas we've been ignored for years. There's now engagement of a negative type. And that engagement, that critical engagement, is coming not just from mainstream, but also from our own tribe, if you like, post-Keynesian economists are attacking us. And the criticisms range from, well, there's nothing new in this literature that's now millions of words big, nothing new at all. We knew this all along. Anything they've got to say, we can subsume and understand from standard existing frameworks. And there's some out there who say we can understand all this in existing ISLE frameworks. No, you can't, but that's what we'll talk about. Some people say what is claimed to be new is wrong, and what is correct about what we say we knew all along. And the other sort of subsidiary criticism that's starting to come out, both from post-Keynesians, one, and a number of new Keynesians, is that, these characters use no formal models, therefore it's not knowledge and not robust. The criticism's not exactly true, but even if it was true, then they would have disregarded Marx and Keynes, for example, as being zero knowledge on that basis. So let me talk about just 4 things tonight, because we haven't got a decade. We've just got about 35 or 40 minutes. 4 things that are of interest that I think are novelties, that is, new things, that new understandings, new knowledge that wasn't in the literature prior to our project beginning, that we've contributed and really are core MMT ideas. The first one relates to the Phillips curve. The second one relates to central bank operations and the way in which the central bank and the Treasury departments work, and it could be Ministry of Finance, depending which country you come from, but we're in America, so we'll call it Treasury today. And one of the really big contributions is what I call exposing the veil of ideology. I'll talk about that. The third novelty is to advance an understanding in very finely grained detail what I call fiscal deficit and debt dynamics. And that allows us to understand, reconfigure an understanding of inflation risk, big macro issues like crowding out, and in a way that's never been discussed before. And the fourth thing is the embrace of developments in other social sciences, because remember that typically economists have the worst cross-citation rate of all the social sciences. And one of the things that I think we've contributed is bringing in other disciplines, and in this case cognitive linguistics, and the way in which language and framing is important to develop economic understandings and narratives. Okay, so the rest of the talk is briefly to explicate each of those things, some in more detail than others, and that'll be it. So think about where we were in the early 90s in terms of understanding inflation and Phillips curves. And I say Phillips curves because the Phillips curve framework is a centerpiece of all the macro theories. I mean, the standard sort of simplified New Keynesian model has three equations, one of which is the Phillips curve. And so it's not just a side issue in the way our profession engages in discussing inflation. And the mainstream Phillips curve approach was what we can simplify as just a Nehru approach. There's debates about the value of the coefficient on the price expectations term, whether it's 1 or not, whether it's temporally different, that is, whether it can be a little bit less than 1 and then 1, once staggered wage contracts adjust, all that sort of stuff. But that's the framework, the framework. And you know, at the extreme end of that school of thought, no trade-off sort of vertical arguments and a complete denial of the real capacity of fiscal policy to do anything that is real, not rather than nominal. This is what I would say would be, at that time, a typical post-Keynesian commentary on the state of the Phillips curve theory. Tom Pelly was often writing about the Phillips curve, and he was one of the few post-Keynesians that did write a lot about it. And this was really, you can criticise it if you like. I think this is fairly representative of where post-Keynesians were at the time. And I've marked the blue, the traditional monetary and fiscal policy have an impact, a quantity impact, but yield no inflation benefit. And this is when you've got wages and markups that are exogenous, that are determined through a conflictual process over distribution claims. And that the only way in which you can pursue expansionary policy in such a Phillips curve space is if you have an incomes policy. And if Phillips curves have been sort of my thing for years, and I'm always told that we need by post-Keynesians that we need an incomes policy. That's the standard post-Keynesian framework in my view. This idea that we've got to batten down the supply, to have any expansionary space, we've got to batten down the supply curve with an incomes policy. The way in which modern monetary theory is constructed, that this idea of price stability, is to say that a currency issuing government has two choices. It can either run an unemployment buffer stock, which is the Nehru approach, and use unemployment to discipline the distributional struggle, or it can alternatively run an employment buffer stock. So the common element here is the use of buffer stocks. And the way in which we conceive of the Nehru approach as a price anchor, so we introduce that terminology, is that it spends on what we call a quantity rule. That is, the government sets a quantity of spending that it's budgeting and spends according to that, and whether that's consistent with full employment spending levels will show up in the size of the unemployment. This is the unemployment buffer. Whereas we specifically now call it the job guarantee. When I first started doing this in 1978, I started talking about buffer stock employment models. And of course then some cows got sick in England and we couldn't call it the BSE anymore. So, my American confrères not being gender specific, we're calling it the ELR. And the ELR, employment of last resort. And that seemed offensive to me, even though I understood that it was an analogue with the lender of last resort capacity of the central bank. That seemed offensive to me because the central bank's dealing with money, inanimate object, and we're dealing here with humans, which is mostly very animate. And so we all agreed, I think, to call it the job guarantee. And the job guarantee had been terminology being used earlier by others. And and I'm not going to, tonight I'm not going to talk in detail about all of the literature on this we've done. I'm just introducing it as the novelty. But our conclusion was that the Nauru is a very costly inflation anchor, whereas the neighbour, the non-accelerating inflation buffer employment ratio, is a superior inflation anchor. And that's core MMT. And I've had lots of criticism through email and counter-blogs saying, well look, most of your MMT ideas are great, but you just got to ditch the job guarantee. It's just peripheral. Well, it's not peripheral, it's the core part of our inflation anchor. You've only got one of two options. Do you want to go the Nauru route, which is the mainstream of existing, or do you want to go a superior inflation anchor? And let me be very clear, the idea of public sector job creation isn't new, we're not claiming that. The idea of the right to work debate is centuries old. They were debating it in the 14th and 15th century. That's not new, that's not our contribution. The use of buffer stocks to control prices is new. And to where I got the idea in 1978 was I was doing an agricultural economics course as a fourth year student at Melbourne University. And the topic of the day was the wool price stabilisation scheme run by the Australian government, where the Australian government would buy up would do a deal with all the farmers to fix their incomes, stabilise their incomes over the year. And then if there was too much wool produced, they took out the market pressure by buying all the wool. And all around Australian cities were these big brick buildings full of wool, a buffer stock of wool. And when the season wasn't as good, so the price didn't go beyond their agreed price, they'd sell out of the wool stores the buffer. That's where I got the idea, and I wasn't the slightest bit interested in wool. But it was full employment of wool, I thought. If the market, to stabilise the price, if it couldn't be bought or sold into the market, the supply, then the government could use the buffer. And at that time in Australia, unemployment was starting to rise in the stagflationary period, late 70s. And that became an idea that you could run a full employment program using a buffer stock. That's where the idea came from myself. Now, Warren later, quite independently, before I even knew him, had already worked that out too. Warren Marsden, that is. And so it's not the use of buffer stocks, it's the introduction of buffer stocks into a Phillips curve framework that's new. And what we've shown, the modern monetary theory has shown, is that for the first time, a currency issuing government can run a buffer stock employment scheme and stabilise inflation by buying on a price rule. In other words, you set a fixed job guarantee wage and you declare an unconditional willingness to buy whatever comes in at that idle labour, comes in at that fixed price. And if there's inflationary pressures in the non-government sector, then the process redistributes resources from the inflating sector to the fixed price sector, and eventually you'll stabilise. And very significantly, I think, the Phillips curve in this environment then disappears, because what we end up with is a dot in inflation unemployment space. Now, if you appreciate the significance of the Phillips curve in the macro literature, then this innovation in knowledge and logic is very novel. Some other important parts of this story is that if you think back to the 60s and then on, one of the really big, and started, the monetarists and these characters, one of the things that they used to disabused policymakers of active fiscal policy were things like timing lags. That by the time the fiscal authority operationalised its stimulus, the private sector spending cycle was improving again, and the fiscal policy then became pro-cyclical rather than the designed counter-cyclical. Well, what the job guarantee is an automatic stabiliser, because it's a capacity that's in place at all times. It's not a program it's budgeted for. It's an unconditional job offer. And it goes up and down with the private cycle, the non-government cycle. So it's an automatic stabiliser that needs some planning to make sure that there's work that can be created quickly. But it doesn't need any legislative process to debate how much money is going to be spent and whether it's going to be spent and holding up in upper houses and all the rest of the political gymnastics that quite often cruelly effectiveness of normal fiscal innovation. Back to that post-Keynesian conversation, the post-Keynesian mainstream of the day always advocated, if you had unemployment, we needed public investment spending. It's what I call a generalised expansion. Well, if you think about a generalised expansion, there's no inflation anchor built into that, because it's buying everything at market prices. The job guarantee buys off the bottom of the market, because the fixed wage becomes the minimum wage, whatever you want, whatever the minimum wage for social standards that you're aspiring to become. You could set the minimum wage above the existing private sector wage and drive low wage private firms out of business if you wanted to. That's a political and social choice. The other thing about the job guarantee is it becomes spatially calibrated. You can actually, it's available anywhere. So you don't get this tension between the economic settlement and the social settlement, which is one of the real problems in societies where regional areas are hollowing out because the work's gone. And a lot of regional centres are just becoming geriatric places where old people are just dying and their children have gone. But the last thing I'll say about this point here is that it's not just a job guarantee, a job creation scheme. A lot of people say to me, oh, that's just an elaborate job creation scheme. Well, it sort of is, obviously, because it's an unconditional job offer. But for MMT, it's a macroeconomic stabilisation framework, because embedded in it is the inflation anchor. And we've never held out that it's the solution to everything. But it's the minimum that a currency issuing government should put in place as a responsibility, because we were having this conversation earlier, that one of the major change that occurs when you go into a state money system, the one big change from a barter to a state money, a fiat currency system, is that you've got to get people to use your currency. And that requires you impose taxes to create a demand for the currency. Another MMT idea. And as soon as you create a tax, that's tantamount to creating unemployment, because you're creating a demand for that currency, and people are willing to offer services. And if you don't meet that demand for spending at least as much as the taxation, then there will be mass unemployment. Okay, moving on quickly. The second area where I said there was a novelty was in discussions about central banks and treasuries. And what the criticism in the literature now is, it's emerging and becoming amplified because more and more people are jumping on this claim, is that we live in a fiction, MMTs live in a fictional world, that we've made up this world, and and all of our propositions are just a reflection of this fiction we've created. And they point out that, well, governments can't spend first, which they say is an MMT statement. They say, what MMT says is that a currency issuing government is never financially constrained intrinsically in spending. It can buy whatever is available for sale in its own currency. That's what MMT says. The criticism then says, well, no, it can't. That's a fiction. And what they point out to is, they say because another point about MMT is we start off with a consolidated central bank and treasury as a government sector. We consolidate those two functions. And there's good reason to do that. There's pragmatic reasons, because if you know how those institutions operate on a daily basis, you'll know that the central bank and the treasury are in constant contact in the mornings, because they have to be. If the central bank is the operations desks are engaged in liquidity management so that they can maintain their target policy rate. And the Treasury, of course, or the finance ministries know what's going on in terms of outflows and inflows related to fiscal policy. And of course, they've got to coordinate and synchronise them so that the central bank can maintain its liquidity management. So of course they've got to work together intrinsically. But I'll come back to that. And of course, it's pointed out in the literature saying, well, these MMTs, don't they know that there's independent central banks? Don't they know that there's all these fiscal and accounting rules like tax and loan accounts in America and other accounting structures in different countries? Don't they know that there's got to be money in these accounts before the government can, before the central bank will allow the governments to spend out of it? Don't they know that? And these criticisms, when they first started to emerge, they implicitly assume we're dogs. So they're unbelievable that, as if these characters have never thought about this. And some years before these criticisms started to emerge, around 2011 these criticisms started to emerge, some years before that, I'd written an article outlining the role of these voluntary constraints that governments and these accounting structures that governments put in place. And as an aside, one of the characteristics of a lot of these criticisms is that the critic has never really discloses the fact by omission rather than admission, that they haven't actually read all the primary literature. There's these sort of critics building on critics, and so MMT position becomes what the last critic said it was. And so the way to think about the consolidation of the Treasury and the central bank, which is core MMT, with the fact that of course there's all of these voluntary constraints and accounting procedures and rules and regulations about the way governments spend and not. Of course there's that. The way to think about this is, the way I think about it, and I'll explain it, is through my understanding of Marx. And one of the great things that I learned when I was a young boy, reading Capital and Wage and Labour and all of these other documents that Marx had written, was that this exposition of the superficiality of exchange relations, to understand the intrinsic nature of the capitalist mode of production. You can't view it from the level exclusively of the exchange relationships. The so-called wage form is highly misleading. The idea that you get $8 an hour for 8 hours a day leads, if you take that literally at a superficial level, leads you to think that the worker is getting paid for 8 hours of production. That's the wage form that hides the reality of the capitalist production process. And so Marx said that obviously you've got to dig down underneath this superficial level. And the early Marxian critics of neoclassical economics made this point very clearly. You know, the classic statement is Samuel Britton in 1968, who was editor of Financial Times, I think at the time, saying, well, to understand the labour market, it's just like the market for bananas. Well, no, it's not. Because in the market for bananas, the exchange relationships, the use values and the exchange values are separated. The transactions exchange, and the banana seller takes the income, and the banana guy leaves the exchange and eats the banana. Guy being not gender specific. Whereas in the labour market, you don't sell labour in the labour market exchange, you sell labour power. And of course the labour is extracted while the exchange is still in place, not after you go home from work. And so it was to me that was a great contribution of Marx to really explain the origins of profit and the misleading nature of the wage form and the superficiality of exchange relations. And it was a very powerful piece of analysis, because then the riots began, because workers realised they were being dudded. We'll think about that, and this is how I explain the way MMT operates. We have two levels of reality. One level is the actual institutional practices with their intended voluntary constraints that governments have put in place to regulate their own behaviour. They're totally voluntary. They vary depending upon the ideology of the day. So, for example, in the early 1980s, the Australian government used to run a TAP bond issuing system where they would announce a yield they were prepared to pay, say 5%, and they would say they want to borrow 20 billion Australian dollars at 5% fixed yield. And they'd turn the tap on depending upon the bond dealers would then come in and they'd buy whatever they wanted. And if they judged that the fixed yield was not competitive relative to their options, they mightn't buy any. Who'd buy the rest? The central bank would. And once neoliberalism came along, that was deeply offensive to them. And so they went to an auction system where the private sector, the bond dealers, determine the yield as the last bid that absorbs the bid, the tender. And the head of the Australian Financial Management, Office of Financial Management, which is a division of Treasury that manages debt issuance, was openly explicit. He said this puts a discipline on government because they know that debt is politically charged. So these institutional arrangements are ideology and they fluctuate. So, and the second level of reality, which is the level that MMT has exposed, is the intrinsic nature of the monetary system. Stripped away from the politics and the ideology, what are the intrinsic nature of this system? And so when you're thinking about the second level of analysis, you won't find that in the mainstream texts and you won't find it in the extant post-Keynesian texts. That's our contribution. And the first level up there is the world of politics and ideology. And so by having a level of analysis that conflates the central bank and the Treasury and exposes the intrinsic nature of the monetary system, we're really showing that these voluntary constraints provide a veil of ideology that is essentially undemocratic because it hides the reality of the system and makes it look as though the government can run out of money. And so when the government doesn't want to deal with 10% unemployment, and it tells the electorate, we can't deal with this because we haven't got enough money, MMT provides citizens with the capacity to know that that's an outright lie. And it forces the public debate then to say, why don't you want to spend the currency that you have? You must want that unemployment. And once these ideas permeate, my view is that that will change the political debate, because the neo-libs are going to have to come clean. They'll no longer be able to say, we will run out of money. Okay, moving quickly. The other point also, and this is just a little more detail, many of what look like voluntary constraints are in actual fact what we call reserve maintenance operations. And the example I give here are, and to some extent, the intrinsic nature, those levels that are identified are actually become blurred, because in some cases you can't actually hold the intrinsic nature of the monetary system. An example I give here are the T&L accounts, and I use that as a US example because I'm in the US today. And the government spending adds to bank reserves. Once the money goes into banking deposits, they show up ultimately in bank reserves. And when the government levies taxes, those taxes drain bank reserves. And so at that point, the T&L funds are shifted to some Treasury account at the central bank. And they have to do that to maintain the desired liquidity in the cash system. And so these synchronised transactions are interpreted by the mainstream as financing operations when they're really just liquidity management operations, because if the Reserve Bank didn't do those, the central bank didn't do those offsetting accounting entries and shifting numbers in accounts, then they'd have an incompatible level of reserves in the banking system, incompatible with its target interest rate. And similarly, debt issuance MMT demonstrates how debt issuance isn't a funding operation. Now, when you think about it, debt issuance is totally nonsensical. After August 1971, or whenever the other nations decided to break with Bretton Woods, and they did it in a sort of staggered way, governments no longer needed to borrow because they were free, their exchange rate responsibilities were free. And what MMT shows is that through these accumulated effects on bank reserves, when the government issues debt, it's really borrowing just back its pass-through deficit. And as a matter of logic, something in the past can't be funded by something in the future. And our early work, and this is before the crisis, was to demonstrate that the only use of government debt was to maintain liquidity management in the banking reserve system. Because if the fiscal deficits push up reserves, and of course excess reserves are not wanted by the commercial banks because they're not going to generate a competitive return. Pre-crisis we're talking. And so in the interbank market, they're trying to get rid of those, and they're trying to lend and find other banks. Because remember, the reserves aren't lent out to anybody else. They're just circulated among the banks that have accounts with the central bank. And of course, that competitive process to try to eliminate excess reserves ends up in driving the interest rate down. And of course, if the central bank's got a 5% target interest rate, that's the policy rate, and there's excess reserves and there's competitive process driving that rate down, of course the central bank then loses control over its monetary policy. And the extreme is that that goes like Japan to zero, which was its monetary policy target. And so the way in which the central bank can maintain its liquidity desires in terms of levels of reserves, and therefore maintain its monetary policy stance in the face of continuous fiscal deficits, is to be draining those excess reserves. And how do they drain them? They sell bonds to them in exchange for reserves. That's not a financing operation, it's a monetary operation. And so in all the textbooks you'll see debt issuances in the fiscal policy chapter. It's got nothing to do with fiscal policy necessarily, it's a monetary operation. Of course, that need to drain reserves with bond issuance is really unnecessary if you're wanting to pay support rates on excess reserves, which is the current practice. So none of these insights were in the extant economic literature. None. Okay, the third thing, fiscal dynamics and fiscal rules. I'll go quickly now. Warren and Matt Forstater, I forgot to mention Matt as one of our early group. Apologies if you're in the room. They brought out a very insightful piece of work where they distinguished between what they call vertical transactions within a currency system between a government and a non-government, and horizontal transactions between non-government entities, banks and individuals. This was novel. Why was it novel? Because the implications for the net financial worth of the non-government sector are different depending whether it's a vertical transaction, which could be a government spending, could be a tax hike, central bank buying gold, for example. But let's say government spending and taxation. The implications for the net worth of the non-government sector are quite different to those where there's horizontal transactions occurring. So when the government spends some dollars, the net worth of the financial assets of the non-government sector increase. When it taxes the non-government sector, the financial assets in net terms decline. Whereas when the horizontal transactions don't alter the net financial assets of the non-government sector. They might alter the composition of those assets, but they don't alter the net position. Now, why is that an important point? Well, first of all, if you think to any of the mainstream textbooks, there will be a chapter on fiscal policy. And it's typically done in an IS-LM framework or an AS-AD framework, doesn't matter. And then students are introduced to the three types of financing for fiscal policy. Taxation, debt, money creation, printing money, that's what it's called, even though there's no printing presses have ever run. And then students are entertained, put to sleep in other words, by these elaborate discussions of the different implications for inflation of these different forms of funding. And students are led to believe that if the government sells bonds, that will be less inflationary, but less expansionary, I should have said that the other way around, than if the government has money creation. And so you get these discussions that, well, money creation is as skewed as a taboo because it's going to lead to hyperinflation. Bond issuance is preferred to money creation, but bad because it builds up public debt. And so the best thing is to run fiscal balances. But what MMT has, I believe, demonstrated, which is new, is that type of analytical thinking is totally wrong. That the inflation risk is embedded in the government, any spending. And government spending is always monetisation. All this idea that students learn that some government spending is tax financed, some of it's bond financed, and some of it's the result of money creation. That's not a description of reality. Government spending is all just money creation of reserves. And then what monetary operations might happen coincidentally to that, but not causally, is a separate issue. And that insight then gives you another set of understandings. And that is, if you think about the impact of fiscal deficits on the banking system, well, there's no way that there can be financial crowding out. And it's not the post-Keynesian argument that global capital will come along and save the day. It's the fact that the way in which fiscal deficits impact upon the reserve system, as I described before, is to put downward pressure on the interest rates. How does that work? It works because fiscal deficits increase reserves. And if those reserves are excess to the commercial banks' projected reserves to satisfy what they think they'll need for the clearing system, well, then they'll try to get rid of those reserves to earn a competitive return. And that competitive process puts downward pressure on the interest rate. Now, it may not drive the interest rate down because that depends on what the central bank does, but it puts downward pressure. And so the idea that the mainstream idea that students learn is that the IS curve shifts and that pushes up the money demand, and depending upon the interest rate and income sensitivity of money demand, interest rates rise as well, and that crowds out into other forms of interest rate sensitive spending. That can't be right. And then the post-Keynesian, the sort of mainstream post-Keynesian arguments of the day then used to argue about the slope of the IS curve. And they'd say, well, the crowding out's going to be a minimal problem because the IS curve's steep, because current investment isn't particularly sensitive to current interest rates. Logically, it really can't be at all sensitive to current interest rates because it's plans taken years ago. That's an aside. That's a new insight that wasn't in the existing literature, which is incredibly important insight because it's a major vehicle in the public debate to disabuse us of the use of fiscal policy, that it will damage private investment. Or rather, what MMT supports is the crowding in type approach. That if the government runs a full employment economy, a robust economy where people have got incomes and wages and spending and jobs, then that will be a very conducive environment for private investment. Okay, I'm just about finished. So then we get into discussions about what fiscal sustainability is and what the concept of a cost of the policy program is. And if you read mainstream literature and in the policy literature, it comes out from the OECD or the IMF or the World Bank or even UNDP. Have got a website about fiscal sustainability. And you'll read about it all in terms of fiscal space, and it will be all in terms of debt ratios and deficit to GDP ratios, all self-contained logic, as if you can define what a fiscal deficit, the appropriateness of a fiscal deficit by some level of the fiscal deficit. And the implication is that a 2% fiscal deficit of GDP is better than a 5% deficit. Well, what MMT says is that sometimes a deficit of 10% of GDP might be appropriate and sustainable. Sometimes a 2% deficit might be appropriate and sustainable, and sometimes a fiscal surplus might be appropriate and sustainable. And what does it depend upon? It depends upon the relationship between the government spending and the real economy. You can't define fiscal sustainability in a circular way in terms of the balance itself. Some threshold, the Rogoff threshold, 80%, what's that mean? Nothing. And so you've got to define fiscal sustainability in terms of providing sufficient net spending into the economy once the private sector has made its spending and savings decisions, such that all the available resources that want to be utilised are brought into productive use. And that's fiscal sustainability. In other words, the fiscal balance should just be whatever it takes to reach that position. And that's a world apart in conceptualisation and policy insight than you see in any mainstream or any post-Keynesian of that era when we started. Because what the post-Keynesians of that era used to say is that deficits are okay when there's a downturn, when there's a stimulus, but they've got to be offset when we're in an upturn to ensure that the debt ratio stays stable. MMT doesn't think that at all. Deficit is effectively an irrelevant number to compute. That's what I think. And the cost of the program, when, this idea of the cost of the program, the cost of that particular public expenditure is X number of dollars. And I'm continually being asked, well, what would the cost of a job guarantee be? And what I say is, the additional food that the workers will be able to eat, the additional tractors or whatever that's needed to, capital equipment that's needed to accompany the work activity, that's the cost of the program. It's the extra real resources that are needed. Because for a currency issuing government, the only thing that it has to ensure is that the real resources are productively used. The numbers that are put in pieces of paper that are called budgets are irrelevant. That's new, and none economists don't think like that to be true. Okay, I think I've done enough. And the last thing I won't talk about, because we've got enough, is this use of language. You'll notice I never use the term budget deficit or budget balance. I always talk about fiscal balance. And that's because if you study this literature and learn about how people cognate, that is, learn and acquire knowledge and understandings of their reality, it's through the use of metaphors. And this is the work of Ronald Lanka and George Lakoff and others. And it's important as economists, if you want to have a dialogue with, a policy dialogue with citizens, it's important to understand how citizens actually learn and build understandings of their realities. And so language becomes very important because one of the ideological constructs that mainstream economists use is metaphor and language. And and just as the example I gave, we're continually berated with this idea that the fiscal balance, the budget of the government, is just like the household budget.
Who said that?
Huh?
Who said that?
Barrow said it.
That's not post-Keynesian.
No, some of my criticism about post-Keynesian, some of them about mainstream. Okay? Barrow wrote that. That's a mainstream understanding, and it's used as a metaphor to get us to relate experientially our own circumstances as if they're the same circumstances confronting a government. And of course, the government isn't a big household. We've got financial constraints. The government doesn't have financial constraints. And so the use of language is very important. And I'll leave it there.
There are microphones.
Since you trying to put distinction between MMT and post-Keynesian, and then you use Tom Paley as who's a terrible, who calls himself a post-Keynesian, but I should call your attention to that Paul Samuelson also called himself a post-Keynesian. So that just because one calls himself, so I think I'm a post-Keynesian. And let me tell you what I think is not new that you said was new in your mind. First of all, buffer stocks. The idea of buffer stocks maintaining people's income, etc., is as old as the Old Testament. Joseph, the economic advisor to the Pharaoh, told the Pharaoh that when the agriculture was in bad state, the government got to go in and buy the grain, store it away, and when prices start to rise, sell it and maintain a price level and maintain the income of the agricultural sector. So buffer stocks is a very old policy.
Quite old on that. I said the use of buffer stocks for price control is not new. I never claimed it.
But I'm going to get to your job creation, which is a buffer stock argument. I should point out, however, that Keynes, in the Treatise of Money, talks about two types of inflation: commodity inflation and income inflation. And the solution for commodity inflation, where prices, is buffer stocks. Now, job creation, okay, job guarantee. That sounds like something new. Did you ever hear of something called the Civilian Conservation Corps of the Roosevelt administration? What was it? It was a job guarantee. You took the young people who couldn't get jobs and you took them and put them in a corps, and you took them to that's outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, and that's why I know a lot about it, because I looked at the history of this. And you gave them jobs to do that nobody really needed the product. They built paths in the Smoky Mountains and things of that sort, which at that point in time was not a very big tourist attraction. What was the function of that? It was to make sure that the civilian population got a guaranteed minimum income. These young men sent their money back to their families who still lived in the cities and so on. So Roosevelt wasn't only a stimulus, New Deal, we usually think of as a stimulus, going out and producing things, giving WPA and things of that sort, building infrastructure. But it was also located with a job guarantee thing. So that's not a new idea.
Well, read those 3 lines, please.
Yeah. But the answer is, that's not new. Post-Keynesians know about it, and in fact, if you would have read some of the stuff that I did rather than Tom Paley did, you would have seen that was in a number of things that I wrote long time ago.
Paul, I've never read one of your articles, and I've read almost all of them, I'm sure. You've never related job creation schemes for a currency issuing government as a macroeconomic stability framework and embedded it within a Phillips
Well, the answer is because in the Great Depression we had unemployment of 20 and 30%, and job creation was important. In the recent years, when it goes over 5 or 6 or 7%, we think of this as terrible rates of inflation. You don't need job creation when there's only 5 or 6 or 7%. It's not that. If you create a little more market demand for private enterprise, that 5 or 6 or 7% can get easily absorbed. So there's no real reason for job guarantees unless you got 15, 20%, because you can't generate enough market demand in the private sector to absorb 20% of the labor force all within a short period of time. So that's the point.
Well, that's a separate issue.
Huh?
That's a separate issue.
Well,
We're talking about novelty, not...
I mean, what
I think we need to.
let me finally say about income.
Last question.
Okay, a neighbor of mine when I lived in Princeton was Al Reese. Now, Al Reese was appointed by Nixon to be head of the Wages and Price Stability Committee, okay, to prevent inflation. And Al and I used to have big arguments about how do you prevent inflation. And I would say, well, we need income policy, keep labor costs, and so on, profits and so on, use the income policy. And he would slam the walls. They said, that's the trouble with you Keynesians. You don't believe in our incomes policy, which is to create enough, what Milton Friedman called the natural rate of unemployment. If you create enough unemployment, you don't have to worry telling labor to keep its place. Okay. But that's an incomes policy, you see. The whole Phillips curve is really an incomes policy of a different sort. Okay. So what's the monetary MMT solution to inflation?
Collapse the
That's not an income.
income.
That is not an incomes policy. Let me know what it is. Nothing that you said told me anything about if labor is powerful enough to get high wages, what do you do to prevent it? Okay, if OPEC has enough monopoly power to raise world oil prices, what was that? That was income redistribution from the consuming nations to the producers. How do you stop that? What is MMT going to tell us about fighting OPEC?
I told you before, you redistribute labour from the inflating sector to a fixed price sector.
What? That's right.
You redistribute the resources from the inflating sector to the fixed price sector.
But how do you stop OPEC from raising prices? And the answer obviously is one of two things. One is you prevent, one is North Sea oil or fracking in the United States, which now we now become one of the largest producers of oil in the world, almost threatening Saudi Arabia in terms of production of oil, fossil fuels, I should say, to the Middle East. But
Unless some Robert.
I just want to know what is new about MMT.
I've just spent an hour talking about it. I won't bore anyone.
Well, please, just read the first 3 lines.
Bill, I've got the mic.
Yeah, right here.
Bill, I've got the mic up here. Bill, the chair.
This person was first.
I don't have to. It's coming. No, she's right there.
First of all, I found that really interesting, fascinating talk, and I learned a lot from it. A lot to think about. But there's just one point, I think, where the novelty isn't quite as great as you say. I mean, the idea that the fundamental purpose of a budget was not to balance the government's accounts, but to balance aggregate demand and supply, in other words, to balance the nation's account, is in Keynes very, very explicitly. And it's also repeated by some of the Keynesians of the new classical, synthesis. Paul Samuelson says exactly the same thing. Now, it may not have been actually accepted by governments. They thought that there was some special virtue in balancing the government's books. But nevertheless, the idea was there as a theoretical conception, and it was a logical conception. If you believe that there is a problem of balance, the private sector can't do it alone. So all I wanted to say about that is that idea as novel as you explained in your speech.
It's a good question, and my colleagues can have can say what they think. But what I think is that the novelty is, I mean, Keynes, for example, not in the general theory, but later, and we've had this conversation, had rules about capital and current, desired behaviour of capital and current budgets in inverted commas. That's one point. So he wasn't unambiguously advocating fiscal deficits. And of those of the day, and it was much more fashionable, as you point out, in those days to allow a fiscal deficit. The view about them was that they were special purpose only in a downturn.
Yeah.
And the expectation would be that you would not run continuous fiscal deficits. Now, I think the MMT position is different to that. And that is that A, there's no special distinction between recurrent and capital spending, because that framework is built upon some sort of temporal division of when the benefits are going to occur from the spending. And for paying teachers' wages, which would typically be a recurrent expenditure, why doesn't that deliver long-run productivity benefits to the community? In other words, it's got an infrastructure component. So I think that division that Keynes himself used and was very popular, and really is the golden rule, isn't it? Germany had a golden rule before it went into the euro, is deeply flawed. That's an MMT point. And the second point that MMT makes is that the deficit should never be a policy target. Because A, point number one, it's endogenous. Any government says we're going to get a 5% deficit and that's good. You can't do that necessarily. It has got no control over that. The non-government sector generates the deficit for the government or whatever the balance is. And so the MMT point is that the focus of attention shifts from the discussion about a fiscal balance to the discussion about the real sector. And there's no, and if the external sector situation, and I'm thinking sectoral balances here, if the external sector situation and the saving investment balance in the private domestic sector is such that you have to run a 10% fiscal deficit in perpetuity, then so be it. Whereas an old-fashioned Keynesian would be horrified by that statement.
We can go on talking about this later.
That's the way I think about it.
Bill, I've got my...
Randy, you should get up here because there's lots of hands and you need to get them in order.
You can choose them.
Question.
I think it's fine if you choose.
Well, I
you
think
point, and then we'll give them a mic.
I think it was Anwar first, and then no, sorry, there was Shane, and then Anwar, and then down there.
Our Australian colleague, Frank Stillwell, doesn't believe that money should be a store of value. What does MMT think? And what is...
We can't hear you.
Our Australian colleague, Frank Stillwell, doesn't believe that money should be a store of value. So what does MMT think? And also, what does MMT think about appropriate currency areas? And what does MMT think about having unit of value tethered to reality rather than just being a social construct?
I'm not sure why you channeled Frank, because he's not a macroeconomist for a start, but
Well, it's rather, he and I share the same view. I didn't want to mention myself.
oh, well. very modest. Okay, very modest. The sort of questions are almost too lateral to answer.
Thank you.
Um,
Okay, that's enough. You
I
don't
mean-
have an answer. That's
I mean,
engage, you're engaged.
I'm going to. It's difficult to talk about money, and if you're talking about bank deposits or liquid wealth, is that what you're talking about?
I'm talking about the functions of money, and should a function of money fit for purposes of medium exchange also be a stored value?
Well, the reality is that it's one part of a wealth portfolio.
Hmm?
It becomes one part of a wealth portfolio.
Exactly, and competes with other real resources. So what does MMT say about that?
It doesn't say anything.
Nothing. Okay, that's all right. I just want to know where the gaps are in your theory.
Okay. Right? Yeah, Anwar.
Thank you. Was this on? Yeah. I really
Robert
appreciate it.
and then James. No, Robert behind you. Sorry, Andy.
No, sorry. I appreciated the sense that you had of being excluded from the discourse, as a sense I share, and many of us share, though we don't necessarily belong to the MMT side of that exclusion. But I think I'm a little concerned by the narrative, and you mentioned so much about framing and usage of word, is the narrative which focuses on the sort of lack of comprehension of neoclassical economists, when at the same time many people were making arguments parallel or contradictory to MMT, were also making the same criticism of the neoclassical economists. And as a long-standing member of ERPI, I can think of 100 cases here. I always thought of the core of the MMT argument in a story that John Kenneth Galbraith, the other Galbraith as we now call him, mentioned in his book on money about Pancho Villa printing money by the yard and using it to finance the Mexican Revolution and do whatever he wants. So that's that's what I think of the MMT version of the state. You know, it can print money by the yard. And I think that's the truth of fiat money. But had Pancho Villa gone and announced that he wished to reduce the money supply by raising taxes, he would have been shot, because the early founders of the US itself were extremely hostile to the notion that taxes are merely an algebraic operation. Every individual gets taxed differently and the effects are different. So I think the notion that it's not a constraint is just not true. It's a very serious constraint, which is the basis for central bank independence, considering the history of inflations across the world. And that raises a second question: what's the theory of inflation? As I understand it, and I spent some time in my book going through all the different arguments made by the best people on any particular point of view, including MMT, based on markup pricing in the Phillips curve. Now, I would argue that the Phillips curve is wrong. It doesn't work. It's not theoretically correct nor empirically correct. And so then the question arises, what are the implications for MMT other than the Pancho Villa part of the story, which you can print as much money as you want, and if you don't get shot, you can take it out. And I think then there should be more of a discussion among those of us who are on the same opposition to neoclassical theory, but not necessarily on the MMT side. And I would look forward to that.
Thank you. It's quite clear that there's been a very vigorous opposition to neoclassical economics for many years. And we both grew up in that period of opposition, long before the ideas that we've been working on reform. And so I just gave one example about crowding out, for example. You know, crowding out was discredited before we came along. But it's the way we discredit it provides different insights and extra knowledge. So it's not the externalisation of financial flows that matters for whether crowding out's valid or not. It's the way in which fiscal deficits impact upon bank reserves that really matter. And that's the point I'm making. I'm not suggesting that there wasn't robust wall of criticism. I didn't suddenly turn non-neoclassical when I became an MMTer. That's the first point. The second point is that what you said about taxation is exactly true. But I think all you're really agreeing with is that it's a part of the political and ideological veil. And of course that's a constraint.
I'm not biased, it's a real effect.
No, it's not an intrinsic constraint though. And so, because it can't be an intrinsic constraint to the way in which the monetary system design is. It's a political constraint. And it's not a voluntary constraint. There are voluntary constraints, but it's a political or ideological constraint. So it's a constraint nonetheless. But by understanding what I introduced as those two levels of reality, then you've got different questions to ask and a different public discourse to pursue, I think. That's that point. And what was the third one again?
Oh,
Oh,
I
the
think
Phillips theory of
the
inflation.
Phillips curve.
Well,
Markup pricing and the Phillips curve, those two,
you know,
nexus of those.
from my perspective, I was, and it reflects my age, was the debate in the Marxist debate about real distributional struggles becoming incompatible with the nominal expenditure stream. Now, you can put a markup pricing into that if you want to. You don't have to have it. You can derive the result formally in any way, a different way. But to me, and you'll note that I didn't claim that MMT had a novel theory of inflation, because a vast edifice of modern monetary theory is derived from existing knowledge, like any development in knowledge is. And we respect that and always acknowledge that. So for me, my theory of inflation, given that Phillips curve has sort of been, and inflation's been a central part of my lifelong research, is that it's about distributional struggles in a class conflict system. And it's a fight over real resources. So to say MMT doesn't have a theory of inflation doesn't contradict anything I've said today, because we're not claiming, not claiming that to be a novelty. It's a derivation that we've built in. There's Robert, then there's James, and then there's Stephen.
First of all, very, very interesting. My question has to do with your approach in the world of robots. And in a sense, I understand that your proposition that it can all be handled by monetization can be handled. It assumes a huge productive capacity that is not being unleashed. That's the way and I think there is a huge. But what will MMT, is it, when everything is done by robots, do we monetize and the government decides, how we employ people to give massages and things like that? I mean, is there any thought about that at all? What do we do in the world of robots?
I've got a book coming out soon on issues, and one of the issues is how do we cope with the second machine age, which is what you're talking about, the robotisation. And the thesis that's underlying what your question reflects your question is this idea that, well, there were Luddites and they were proven wrong because, productivity was risen, living standards rose because of the first machine age. And that increased productivity creates increased incomes and releases labour for new products to emerge, and you have compositional shifts in technology and industry structure, but we're all better off in the end. And then the thesis, as I understand it, is the second machine age is saying, I don't want to channel our enemies, this time it's different. That the pace of technological change and the implications of the second machine age are vastly different to the implications of the first machine age. And so, basic income proponents are saying, now using that as their primary justification for, the IMF put out a paper last week, or it might have been a week before on this, that the prima facie case for an income guarantee is the robots, the second machine age. Now, my view is that, there was a wonderful book, and I'm just trying to remember who wrote it. It was called The Tacit Dimension. Does anyone remember who wrote it?
Polanyi.
Polanyi, Michael Polanyi. In 1966, I think he wrote it. And what he was saying was that there's some tasks. So he was contesting the idea of substitution, a perfect substitution of machines to humans. And what he was saying was that there's things we don't know we know. That's his famous quote, I think. And that these are these tacit things that can't computerised, that can't be codified, and which is the way robots are going to take over. And because they're tacit, we actually don't know how we do things. It's a whole range of activities that are very important in our productive processes that we don't know how to do. In other words, we can't code. And so my feeling is that yes, there's going to be fantastic changes in the type of, in the way jobs are constructed and the type of work. There's going to be a whole lot of losers out of that. Any of the jobs that could be routinised are going to go very quickly. But there's still going to be a massive number of jobs that can never be routinised, or aspects of jobs. So there could be changing of job descriptions with interaction with robots, for example. And these are these higher order design type jobs and etc. And there's going to be a whole lot of jobs that we've never even envisaged to be productive work within a gainful worker concept. And with ageing societies, the huge demand is going to be in personal care services. Now, while robots are going to be able to run some of, and there's also going to be a massive number of jobs in environmental restoration, for example. And while some of those will be able to be routinised and robotised, there's going to be a whole lot of other new jobs limited by our imagination that will have to engage as productive work. That's my response. So yes, there's going to be huge ructions, and we're going to have to create what I call a just transition framework so that the losers are not big losers.
But that will be monetized. We're going to finance it by monetizing those jobs. That's the question.
The private market will create new jobs as it sheds old jobs, and the government will, in my perfect world, the government will have its normal labour market, but it will still keep a buffer stock. And that buffer stock will never go short of productive work, because that's limited, in my view, by our imagination.
So the second machine age is essentially just the same as the first, in a way.
It probably demands more of us by way of adjustment, because the pace of technology and the spread of technology is going to be probably greater than the early technology changes. But I think that, and what it will lead to is a societal debate about what meaningful work is. And it's going to be almost a paradigm shift in the way we think of productive work. But it won't wipe out. It won't deny humans the capacity to do work. That's what I think. Yeah, sorry, there's two more. James?
Two comments and then a very small question. The first comment is about novelty. I'm actively opposed to claims of novelty, reasons you expressed a few minutes ago. It seems to me that what is important is whether, and what the real contribution that MMT is making is that it is framing the argument in a persuasive way and thereby making a compelling claim to a piece of the pedagogical space and of the political space. And that should be the objective. Claims of novelty tend to get in the way because they tend to be exclusive and they tend to draw distinctions which people are going to dispute. So I would urge more emphasis on the framing and less on that.
I mean, as you know, that is our emphasis.
Yeah, I understand, but the second point about framing at this stage of the debate is that it seems to me it would be very important to move beyond the discussion of the Phillips curve, which is, after all, archaic at this stage. The Phillips curve collapsed in the data 35 years ago. Yeah. I know MMT has a good discussion of the stage that we're now in which essentially the price levels given from the outside of almost any economy. It's an international phenomenon. It's commodity prices and the prices of labor, goods produced by labor in low-income, low-wage countries and so forth. And so therefore there shouldn't be any relationship between the price level and change of the price level and the employment rate in any given country. But there is a relationship, obviously, to the current account. There's a relationship to this phenomenon of external indebtedness, which again, there's a good discourse on this in the MMT tradition. And it's, I think, exceptionally important to clarify that, because the asymmetric position of major countries, and particularly the United States, makes it quite impossible to pursue a budget deficit target in a coherent or achievable way that's compatible with, for example, the financial position that the dollar holds in external. So that's just the second point. Third thing is a very specific question. And that was provoked by the comment about the spatial characteristics of the spatial capacity of the job guarantee scheme. I wonder if you could comment a little bit on whether there's been really clear development of that idea and how it would work in practice. I mean, are we saying that half the population of Sydney shows up in Alice Springs and demands a job? The Australian government would have to provide for them in that location? Or what are the limits on what is the extent to which administrative considerations would determine exactly how labor would be deployed under that scheme?
Yeah, that's an operational type question. The first two points are great, by the way. In about, I can't remember, about 8 or 9 years ago, we wrote a paper and I coined the term spatial Keynesianism. And this was to try, because one of my other sort of arms of work is regional science and development economics. And we then got a large Australian Research Council grant to study regional aspects of employment creation. And we did a survey of about 140 local government areas and asking them if the federal government paid for this, how many jobs could be created in your area to satisfy community need, what capital requirements would be needed so that they could be accessed by low-skilled workers, what supervisory requirements, what administrative requirements, all of that. And we got a fairly good feel for how we could create hundreds of thousands of jobs in Australia, which is huge, to satisfy community and environmental need. Now, we produced all this operational handbook, 365 odd pages of it, to how it would be administered and all of that. My view is that you're not going to get anyone from Sydney, James, to go to Alice Springs. Alice Springs is in the desert out in the centre of Australia, and Sydney is a cosmopolitan city by the coast with good surfways. So my view is that people, the problem is the opposite problem of people, of the social settlement fragmenting in regional areas because the economic settlements left them. And so my view about the regional characteristics of a buffer stock employment scheme is that people say in Warhope, which is out in sort of interior of New South Wales, the children are leaving those towns because there's no jobs. And they're rushing into Sydney and crowding out the physical infrastructure and making traffic and life hellish. My feeling is that many of those children, not all of them, but some of them, would stay in Warhope if there was an employment guarantee, and that they would tailor their lives appropriately. And I suspect in many of those regional towns, anywhere in the world, those regional areas would retain their viability because there would be work. And depending how you structure the job guarantee, there could be training developments and private sector crowding in, because one of the additional problems of regional areas when they're being hollowed out by lack of jobs, you know, the deindustrialisation phenomenon and all of that, is that they first of all lose the professional services like doctors and lawyers and accountants and that, and then they start losing the retail services because the market becomes too small. And so you lose the main employer leaves, but then the other support private sector employment leaves. And my view is that a buffer stock employment scheme regionally targeted, and it's regionally targeted because anyone can, wherever they live, can get a job in their local area, would maintain a base for those ancillary private sector employers to stay. And then I believe that it would be attractive for other firms who are facing much higher costs in the city to relocate their industry. And so, you know, a big door manufacturer just relocated near my place in Newcastle because factory space is cheap there relative to Western Sydney.
Just to clarify, because I think you would then have a single pay scale for the job guarantee, irrespective of
fixed price. Fixed price.
Fixed price.
Yeah,
so it would in fact induce people to move to lower cost regions, which would tend to revitalize the ones that are currently there.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, good.
And I mean, obviously, you know, you've got to suck it and see. And so if you're starting to get crowds of people flooding into particular areas that there's no housing or no public transport, then there's got to be some operational redesign. But I don't think that will be a problem. I think most people want to work where they can, and particularly low-skilled people in regional areas will always prefer to stay because they actually find it very difficult to migrate because they can't afford housing in the areas where jobs are growing. So I actually think it is a regional stabilisation